And so we move on to section 3 of our geographical process of inquiry. And as ever, we start with our knowledge schema for the entire thing. Remember, they like to give you flowchart questions, leaving some of these stages out. So you do need to know each of the stages as you move down. We've already covered the planning, how we devise our aim, our hypotheses, which are, do you remember what hypothesis means? It's a statement of what the theory suggests should happen, that we will then test. Well, I hope that you were able to get some of those. The risk assessments, and how you might deal with those. And then your primary and secondary sources. Primary is data you collect yourself. That's what we'll be collecting during the field work. And the secondary source that we used was the ArcGIS. Then we had our data collection process, at least virtually during these times of lockdown. We had to take a look at the methods and the equipment. So for example, if you're measuring velocity, what pieces of equipment do you need to measure velocity? There are 3 of them. Do you remember? Well, you measure velocity over a 10-meter section. So what do you need to measure that? That'll be your tape measure. You need to send something down the river to time. What are you going to drop down the river? That'll be your float. In other words, a wee orange. And you'll need something to time it with. That will be your stopwatch. And you will then record your measurements. And the secondary source, remember, is ArcGIS. So please make sure that you're keeping this ticking over in your head. But we're moving on now to this section here on presentation. And there's 2 main elements here for it. It's drawing the graph and then stating why the method is appropriate. So the first thing that I want to do is to consider why it is that you would even think about drawing a graph to begin with. What is the reason why you would do this? You do this in geography, you do this in science. Whenever you have collected the data from your experiment, you turn it into a graph. Why do we do these things? Well, it's partly because of how doing a visual representation of something makes it easier to see and grasp. This is the GCSE specification for paper 3. Now they have put it down in bullet point form here, so it is maybe a little bit easier for you to see than if it had just been in paragraphs. But if you just glance at that, there's nothing that really jumps out. There is no immediate visual pattern to this. In contrast, if I pop up again our knowledge schema, there's a visual representation of the specification, and all of a sudden there's a visual pattern because I've put in these little icons: the planning, the data collection, the presentation, the analysis, interpretation, conclusions, and your evaluation. And because I keep showing you this over and over again, I'm hoping that this is getting imprinted in your head. The visual representation makes it easier to spot what's going on than if it's presented only in words. How does this relate to a graph? Well, there is the table of data that we'll be using to draw our graph. Now, you could say with only 6 sets of data points that it's reasonably easy to get your head around those figures in a table. And yeah, fair enough. If you had 60 data points or 600 data points, which some of tables and spreadsheets can easily have, that's a different story. But even with the 6, let's see what the difference is in terms of the immediate visual impact if I draw a graph. Boom. There it is. Now, look at what you can see here easily, quickly, readily. That is in here, but would take a little bit more unpacking to sort out. For example, you can see here that the distance between survey point 1 and survey point 2 is much, much bigger than all the other distances. Well, yeah, that is in there, but it maybe doesn't jump out immediately. Whereas if you do it in a graph, it really does. So why do we draw a graph? That was this first, or this second bit here. Why are we doing this, and why is the method appropriate? Well, we are doing it because the line graph will help to identify visually the overall trend of the graph more clearly. Look at that. Up it goes. And you can see that very, very clearly. But why a scatter graph? Or you could draw a line graph as well. Why a scatter graph or a line graph? Why would you not draw a bar chart, for instance? I mean, you could show the same kinds of information in a bar chart than you could here. Well, this is an appropriate technique. This is not as an appropriate technique. I wonder, can you figure out why? So the clue was a wee bit, I suppose, in what I pointed out here, that these two survey points are not equally distant from each other. You can clearly see that in the scatter graph, but whenever you do, sorry, I should have changed the title on that one. Whenever you do a bar chart for this, again, you're not getting that clear emphasis, and it looks like there's a massive jump up and then it goes over here like this. In actual fact, when you do it in a line graph, you can see that the increase is reasonably gradual. This is a screen grab from the GIS, and it's why the GIS can be a really useful way of presenting this, because what this is showing you is the proportional circles for the average velocity. So average velocity is increasing as you move downstream, but it's also showing you precisely where those locations were found. And you can definitely see that survey point number 1 up near the source, and a big gap before we come back into the Colin Glen and we're able to carry out the rest of them. So that shows you that there is a gap between them, and the scatter graph does that as well. It really shows that very clearly. So here's what you've got in your notes. Why is this the appropriate technique? Because you've got two sets of numbers. You have got average velocity. You've got distance from the source. So the appropriate way to show those is through, in this case, a scatter graph, or indeed a line graph, because this will show you how, oh, sorry, there's another, I should check this before you commit these to video. Sorry, that should say average velocity. The scatter graph will show how average velocity changes gradually as you move downstream. That is the appropriate technique. So there you go. That's what you've got in your notes. If you're asked a question on why this technique is appropriate, you have two reasons. Two sets of numbers, and the line graph is the appropriate way of doing it. The line graph helps you to identify the trend visually. So that's that bit. What about actually drawing the graph? Well, we did quite a lot of practice in that in class in the Rivers booklet. You may well remember we had page after page after page where I was giving you these different pieces of information of how various variables like width, depth, average velocity and so forth change as you move downstream, and we had a chance of practicing them over and over again. So I have gone over this with you before. Go back into your Rivers book and have a look at that, but I'm just going to remind you of some of the things that we talked about here. Now, one of the first things to say, folks, with this is that this is our data that you're going to be using to draw the graph in the exam. You will take the table of data into the exam with you. You do not need to learn that table of data, but you do need to be familiar with it. The more familiar you are with it, the less likely you are to make mistakes, but you don't need to learn it. So just in case you're thinking, how will I remember all of those numbers? Well, you don't have to. You'll have that table with you. But you can absolutely practice drawing this graph as much as you like. You've got a copy of that in your digital notes. Print that out if you've got a printer at home, and practice and practice and practice. If you don't have a printer at home, we'll be able to give those to you whenever you're in school, and you'll be able to practice and practice and practice. You can be as practiced and prepared for this as you want to be. This is our data. There should be no surprises. Also, there's the mark scheme. We've got that in advance. How brilliant would it be if I was able to say to you for every single exam answer you go into, folks, this is the answer, 100%, this is the answer. I'm absolutely convinced this is the answer. I've no doubt in my mind whatsoever that this is the answer. Oh, and as if that's not enough, would you like to see the mark scheme that is precisely going to tell you exactly how to get all of those marks? You can be as prepared for this as you want to be. Practice, 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 practice. So, just as a quick reminder, 2 marks for the title. Title referring to both variables in the graph, which is distance from the source and average velocity. The appropriate technique, well, we've already covered that. We know the appropriate technique is your scatter graph, so you know you're getting the mark for that one. Accurate and precise plotting. Well, you can practice that as much as you like, because this is our data, all right? You got it? So practice, 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 practice. And then the use of conventions. So both axes need to be labelled. You need to give units. There's no key needed here. And the graph is well scaled. So it's not a wee tiny graph down in the corner. You can practice this as much as you like. You can be as prepared as you want to be for it. Right, we're going to wrap this video up by showing you a couple of examples of graphs that have been drawn, and I'm going to get you to go through those mark criteria there and have a go at marking them. So go ahead and pause the video here and take a few moments to look carefully at this and see what score you would give this one. Okay, you sure you paused the video? You sure how do we go with that one? Because here comes the answer. Right. Title. Up to 2 marks for a title referring to both variables. Graph showing distance from the source. Only one variable. Only 1 out of 2 for that one. Shame, because you could have been as prepared for that as you want to be. Appropriate technique. Yeah, I'd get the mark for that one because it is your line graph in this case. The plotting is fine. Yes, those are all absolutely fine. What about down here? Use of appropriate conventions. Both axes labelled. No labelling of axes here. So maximum get is 1 mark. Units given. No units. So I actually get no marks for that. 1 mark for this, 1 mark for this, 3 marks for this. That's 5. And that's a shame because those marks thrown away are easy marks. Okay, last one. Same again. Pause the video, have a wee look and see what you would score this. Okay, let's have a look. So the title of the graph, title 2 marks for referring to both variables, river velocity and distance from the source. Now I would have preferred if they'd said a line graph in this case, or scatter graph showing river velocity and distance from the source. I would have preferred that said average velocity. Maybe just about 2 marks, but at least they have referred to both variables. A scatter graph showing average velocity and distance from the source. Appropriate technique, yes. The points are accurately located, yes. I'm not a huge fan of this line, however, it's not really well plotted on, so need to be careful and precise with those. What about this? Use of appropriate conventions, both axes labelled, yes. Units given, right, distance from the source in kilometres. And again, average river velocity in meters per second. Average, so at least they're labelled, at least the units are there, but be precise with that. Now, what about this one? The graph is well scaled. No. Look at all this space that's missing here, so you would definitely lose some marks for that one. So you only get 1 mark for that. And again, that's such a shame. It's throwing away marks that are needlessly thrown away. So that's our section on data presentation. The hand-drawn line graph or scatter graph, you can practice that as much as you like. This is our data. There should be no surprises. You see what the mark scheme is. And why is the method appropriate? Well, remember the 2 points that we made is that the graph will help you to see the overall trend more easily and more readily. And when you've got 2 sets of numbers, as you've got here, it's the line or scatter graph, because this will allow you to see things like there's a bigger gap between survey point 1 and 2 than all of the others. And that is how to do your data presentation.